Hello and welcome to a very special episode of MMO Weekly, presented as always by Chitty's Cheesesteaks. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, joined by my co-host who's currently live from the winter meetings in Nashville. Mike, how we doing down there, man?
I'm doing good. I've already eaten way too much food and ready for the meetings to kind of kick off.
That's great. We could have an own show on the food in Nashville itself, but we're here for baseball. Obviously, boots on the ground there. Mets over the past few days have made a lot of signings, a lot of depth signings. So I just want to get your thoughts, reactions, and if there's anything that you've come across over the last day that you've been there, as far as some of the people that the Mets have assigned to bring in here.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it ad nauseum about how the Mets need depth, particularly on the pitching side, and they've added to that, right? I mean, Luis Severino, the other arms they've signed, Kyle Crick, Andre Scrub, the guy they signed yesterday. List goes on and on of kind of the depth pieces that they've created, and that David Stearns knew that. Obviously the Mets are going to continue signing pitching, and it's going to be more of the Yamamotos, Eduardo Rodriguez, bullpen arms like David Robertson, other names there. But these are necessary arms that the Mets need to help eat up some innings in the rotation, hopefully with Severino, and in the bullpen with some of those arms. And like we talked about, this is what Stearns does, right? That's his sweet spot, is finding these arms from kind of nowhere in the bullpen. So you hope out of the 3 or 4 guys that they've picked up already that you get a guy that's a 6th or 7th inning guy kind of out of nowhere on a minor league deal. And that's a huge help to a bullpen that right now just needs a ton of arms.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about pitching, obviously, Yamamoto's the name we've talked about ad nauseum here. Obviously, we've heard Ohtani wants to try and make a decision kind of the end of the winter meetings. Have you heard anything similar with Yamamoto? Is there any sort of timetable, sooner or later before this 45 days is up, that they think that possibly he's going to give a date when he's going to decide or anything like that?
I think kind of the thing that's going to happen is Ohtani is going to sign, and then the teams that missed out on him, while they don't start at the same position next year because Ohtani can't pitch, but Yamamoto is the second biggest prize in terms of money, right? So the teams that miss out on Ohtani are certainly going to have some money to spend, and I think that's kind of when Yamamoto goes. I think he's going to kind of wait it out a little longer. I think there's a good chance that Ohtani signs this week, and then Yamamoto is in the next week or so after he kind of goes through negotiations with those teams that missed out on Ohtani. So, and I think the important thing is that the Mets they're full in on Yamamoto,
Sure.
Regardless of kind of like what happens with Ohtani or other players, that they are full in on Yamamoto. And between them, like we've kind of talked about, this might be the first time that we see them go up against the Yankees, because right now, I mean, things can change, but right now it doesn't sound like Ohtani's coming to New York, which leaves Yamamoto and the 2 New York teams to fight for him, which is very good for him. So, which is why you're hearing the whispers of maybe upwards of 250 million now that he's going to get, and closer to 300 instead of the like 200, 225 a lot of folks were talking about when the winter meeting, the offseason started.
Wow. I mean, the price, every time we talk, Mike, the price seems to be going up for him. It's pretty crazy. Outside of like the Mets, the Yankees, and, I know there's other teams, maybe the Dodgers, depending on what happens with Ohtani. Are you hearing any other maybe sleeper teams that are going to try and go in on Yamamoto or anything like that? Or it's still kind of just the big market players that are really going to be pushing for him?
Yeah, well, I think you're going to get like the Red Sox and the Giants and potentially like the Cubs too if they miss out on Ohtani. Those teams, basically, like I said, that's kind of where it's falling. Is his
Sure.
market's going to kind of depend on what happens with Ohtani and what happens to other pitchers too. Like maybe maybe Montgomery signs in the next couple of days. Maybe Ed Rodriguez signs in the next couple of days. That kind of changes things for a lot of teams, because those 2 guys are like 2 of the prime backup options for Yamamoto. And I know the Mets have shown interest in both of those guys. They've had conversations with agents for both of them because of that. If Yamamoto signs elsewhere, the Mets are going to be aggressive on those pitchers. But I don't think it's an and/or though either. I think the Mets could sign Yamamoto and sign Rodriguez or another type of guy to fill out the middle of that rotation. Because, I mean, we've talked about it a lot. They did sign Severino, but that's more of just depth. They still need 2 front front to middle line starting pitching. So I don't think if the Mets did sign Yamamoto, that would take them out of the running for Rodriguez or a pitcher like him.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, the last time we spoke, we know the Mets have made a couple of signings. Obviously, they brought in Joey Wendell and Luis Severino, like you mentioned. Is there any buzz talking about kind of those signings that kind of think the direction that the Mets are trying to go this offseason? Do people think those were decent, bargain values with high upside? I'm just kind of curious because it's obviously so early in this, and the Mets have so many holes to fill that it's difficult probably to get a whole picture on what they were doing there.
Yeah, I just think it's a little early, but the Mets felt like it was necessary to get some of these pieces signed, some of the depth pieces, so that they could, like we're talking about, Yamamoto, Rodriguez. If we start talking about hitters, Justin Turner, JD Martinez, those type of guys are more than just depth, right? So Stearns really wanted to make sure that he got some of these depth pieces because that's typically like the type of guys that go early because they're not waiting for big money guys to go and be fallback options for them. So I think the Stearns really made sure that he went out and filled some of these depth spots because we talked about within 2 weeks of being GM, he took 12 players off the 40-man roster. So that's a lot of holes to fill right there, and the depth at AAA wasn't very good. So I think the buzz is just basically that these are good, pretty much at market value, getting depth guys that they needed to kind of fill some holes.
Sure. And, we have a question from one of the viewers in right now, AKA Slayer 101, wanted to know if the Mets are going to look to add a DH or an outfielder this offseason. Obviously, last episode, we kind of dove into Justin Turner and JD Martinez, kind of the DH options. But a name has kind of emerged as far as the outfield goes that the Mets have been or had scouted and are looking into Korean outfielder Jung-Hoo Lee. So I was just wondering if you can kind of tell us a little bit about him, if you're hearing anything there on that front. I know the reports have kind of been spurring up the last couple of days on that, so just wondering what you're hearing there.
Yeah, I think there's definitely interest there from the Mets, and there has been in the past just from like a scouting standpoint. When they were doing some pre-WBC stuff and were in the States and Arizona, the Mets scouted him there, and they've scouted him in Korea. And I think he's a fit because you just don't know what's going on with Starling Marte, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't know how much he's going to play, what he's going to do, if he's going to be healthy. So the Mets certainly need some outfield help. Lee can play in center. Obviously, the Mets have a center fielder, so he would play in a corner where he's going to cover plenty of ground in the corner.
Sure.
And on the offensive side, he's kind of, he's a contact guy. He's going to put the ball in play. He's also going to get on base a ton. He's got a little bit of power. In the majors, you're looking at probably 25 doubles, 10 to 15 home runs, that type of guy. He's not a big power guy, but I think he's got some gap-to-gap power, and I think the big thing is you're getting a guy that's going to, at least you believe, that's going to get on base. He's going to steal some bases, and he's going to play good defense wherever outfield spot they put him. So, I think also he had an injury this year and missed part of the season, so I think there's a chance that potentially drives his price down a little bit compared to what they were looking at when the season started, because teams already knew that he was going to be posted before the injury. But he's also got it good on his end for his market that there really just isn't a ton of outfielders on the market right now. They're just, it's thin, not just for outfielders, but offensive players. And I think he's certainly a fit for the Mets because of what they need. He provides them some depth in the outfield. He's going to start in the outfield. He's going to give them some speed and potentially be another guy that gets on base at a high clip. And the Mets' top of the order is pretty set. So if you have a guy like Lee batting in the bottom of the order and getting on base at a high clip, I think that'll really help Lindor and Alonso to have another guy on base besides Nimmo to drive in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Lee's, I believe, a left-handed hitter. You're talking about kind of those, diminished options, especially outfield free agents. What about someone like an Adam Duvall? Do you think they could look there? Obviously, he's right-handed hitter, more pop than I would assume, like you're talking about with Lee. But do you think that the Mets would be more apt to bring in someone like was a better defensive outfielder, higher on base percentage, kind of going that route? Or do you think maybe it depends on where they go as far as if they don't land a JD Martinez or Justin Turner at DH? I'm just kind of curious, comp wise, where you think the Mets would kind of go in that direction.
Oh yeah, I think that's a good point. I think Adam Duvall is certainly like the type of depth piece you would look at. Say if you like sign a Martinez or a Turner and you decide not to put as much into like what you're doing in the outfield potentially, Adam Duvall makes a ton of sense. I know different type of player, but I know like Michael Taylor's been brought up,
Hmm.
someone that
Hmm.
is a good defensive player because, like I said, they just don't have a ton of outfielders, healthy outfielders on the
Right.
40-man roster. I mean, they have Nimmo, Marte, DJ Stewart, and then you have Jeff McNeil, who also plays the outfield when he's moved out there. But they just don't have a ton there. And at AAA, I mean, they are going to have some guys like Acuna and Williams who have some outfield experience in AAA or going to be in AAA. Drew Gilbert will be in AAA too, but those are not guys you want to start the year in the big leagues.
Sure.
Those are guys you want to push during the season to be big leaguers. So, yeah, like Lee, if you can't get a Lee, he goes somewhere else. Adam Duvall makes sense. Taylor, if they're just looking for like a defensive guy, makes a ton of sense. Lourdes Gurriel is another guy
Hmm.
that makes sense for them. I mean, he makes sense for a lot of teams, right? Just
Sure.
because he's so
Sure.
versatile. And again, I think that kind of plays on what they do at DH, because some of these guys don't have a ton of power, like Gurriel, Lee don't have a ton of power, but if they're able to
Right.
get that from the DH, then maybe the outfielder is more of a speed, on base, defensive type. So it'll kind of, you'll have to see like how it plays out and everything. But there's still some options out there for the Mets, and like we said, they've got plenty to do still, even with adding
Sure.
the pieces they have.
Now, obviously, you talked about kind of the young players, right? I'll transition there. I saw, I believe, MMO made Jet Williams the Mets minor league player of the year. Had a great season. Guys, you talked about like Gilbert, who they got in via trades last year. Is there any buzz just around the meetings just about the Mets now kind of minor league system and the guys that they have in place from the last couple of years and then last year kind of with their overhaul at the deadline?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about how the Mets have kind of completely shifted what they had, right? What
Hmm.
they were able to do at the deadline and kind of the breakout from Jet Williams. Obviously, there was high expectations for Jet Williams going into the year, but I think he even exceeded those. And I mean, he's going to be right around the top 50 in a lot of prospect lists nationally. So this is a guy that is obviously generating a lot of buzz, and I think he's got one of those skills that is going to make you a big leaguer. If you get on base at a high clip as he does, over
Hmm.
400, regardless of what else you do well, which he can also steal bases, he's going to steal 35, 40 in a season at least. So that's a skill set that's going to make you at least a reserve um, big leaguer. And the way he's still been able to make contact and he showed a little
Hmm.
bit more power at the end of the year, this is a guy that's looking like a starting big leaguer and a guy that's going to do it for a long time. And that's without talking about like Gilbert, who I mentioned. People rave about Gilbert, especially
Sure.
people that got to see him play for the Mets after the trade. It's just a guy that not only has the raw skills as a hitter and defender, but he just goes all out. He's 110%, 110% of the time, and that's the type of player that teams just love.
It's awesome. Yeah, I mean, again, we've talked about it nauseum. Hoping the future's bright. A few of these guys, hit the Mets hit on, and they can have an extended kind of young core here for the next few years. But kind of last thing, Mike, I don't want to keep you too long. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on there. Is there any buzz of going on just in general? Something surprising, maybe that things could be brewing with the industry. Is there anything new happening or hearing from the Juan Soto front? And maybe is there another team that's emerged? With the trade talks there. I'm just kind of curious. If there's anything interesting that out of the ordinary that you're hearing while you're at the meetings.
Well, I think a couple of people have kind of reported on the Blue Jays about them
Okay.
being real on Otani, and there was some reporting on Soto yesterday, and the folks that I've talked to said that the Blue Jays are absolutely for real on both of these guys. Like
Wow.
they are ready to make a huge push to get one of these guys. They are for real, and they this is legitimate interest. I mean, I know this isn't Mets related, but it's still huge news that the Blue Jays could end up with one of the two best players that are available, right? I mean,
Wow.
Otani as the free agent and Soto as the trade piece. They're obviously 1A and 1B as getting players. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Like we talked about, that really changes the market if, like, the Blue Jays or the Cubs, one of these teams are
Hmm.
able to get Otani or Soto, because that changes a lot. Because we know that the Mets and Yankees want to be aggressive, they have money to spend, and they want to get a big name player. So if one of those big name players ends up going to Toronto, that totally shifts the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing before I forget, I do want to just touch on, if you've heard anything else at, third base options for the Mets. Obviously, Alex Bregman's name has been tossed around the last couple of days. Trade rumors. Matt Chapman's a free agent. I'm just kind of curious if you've heard anything, on the third base front for the Mets as we kind of close things out on this week's episode.
Well, as you bring that up, we'd have to talk about kind of Ronnie Mauricio's second game in the Dominican Winter League, right? The good and the bad. He had 4 hits, 2 extra base hits, and knocked in 2 runs. But also, he played third base and had 3 errors, 2 throwing errors, and a dropped foul pop up. So, look, Mauricio hasn't played a ton of third base, and the Mets are certainly, between them and talking to the winter ball team, they've talked, and he's going to play a lot of third. Mostly, Ellie De La Cruz is going to play on the same team, so that kind of pushes Mauricio to third anyway. So, but he's going to play a lot of third, and look, I think the Mets are going to be pretty happy with a battle between Mauricio and Beatty, and
Sure.
they still feel pretty highly about both of these guys. But like we mentioned, I think the buzz is that they're really going to look for a depth piece there, and just a guy that can play third base, like
Got it.
can play that role, so that if both of Mauricio and Beatty falter, then you have a guy that you can kind of move over there and play a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. A lot of holes for the Mets, as we know, for them to fill, but everything usually starts around this week. So, Mike, I think that's going to wrap up this episode. Enjoy the rest of your time at the meetings. If anything huge happens, we hope you're the first to break it. But, between now and then, always, let's go Mets.